Friends, most Bible translations introduce Luke 15 from verse 11 with a title, calling it the parable of the prodigal son, sometimes the parable of the lost son. But this diverts our attention away from the fact that Jesus begins the story with these words: a man had two sons. This is a story of two sons, not just one. It is also the story of two lost sons, and not just one lost son. The second son, the elder son, doesn't receive much attention in the church or in our preaching, perhaps because he has more in common with most churchgoers than most of us might care to admit. And so today we turn to the parable of the second lost son. His lostness is more difficult to pinpoint. It's more difficult to identify. His lostness is far more respectable, and thus it almost seems that he is not really lost at all. But at the end of the parable, while the first son is described as having come home, having returned to his father's love, the second son, the elder son, is left estranged and alienated from his father and his brother. His story is not resolved. The question is left hanging in the mind of the listener: will the elder son be reconciled with his father? Will he be reconciled with his younger brother? We do not know. We are not told. Jesus leaves it up to us. He plants the seed of the story and leaves that seed to germinate. The problem is we've so heavily fixated on the first half of the story that we seldom reflect on what it might mean to be the elder son. Who is the elder son? Why at the end of the story does he exclude himself? In the first 2 weeks of this sermon series, I reflected on the life of Rembrandt as an aid to reflecting on this on his painting of the return of the prodigal son. And Rembrandt, for a large part of his life, was very much, as we saw, the younger son, who ended his life having squandered much of his wealth. But Henri Nouwen writes that digging a little deeper into Rembrandt's life, it is clear that there is also an elder son living within Rembrandt, a hardness and a self-righteousness that could express itself in coldness and even cruelty. When Rembrandt's wife had died, he had an affair with a woman who he had hired to look after his son, and apparently he had intimated that he would marry her, but he never did, and the whole thing turned sour. She, like Rembrandt, was from the Reformed tradition, and so she took him to the elders of the great kirk, which led to a kind of a church trial for Rembrandt, which didn't end well for him. But his response to her was a vindictive one. And after drumming up false testimonies from his neighbors, he ended up having her committed to a sanatorium, saying that she was mentally unstable. Even quite a number of years later, when she made attempts to be released from the sanatorium, he pulled strings with high-ranking people that he knew to make sure that she would remain inside. He could be both wild and profligate, but he was also capable of being a little cold, cruel, and vindictive. Turning to Rembrandt's painting of the return of the prodigal son, the elder son is depicted in the painting standing on the right-hand side. Strictly speaking, according to the parable, the elder son was not present at the meeting of the father and the son. He only appears much later. And so while Rembrandt's painting is therefore not a factual representation of the story, what he's trying to do in one frame is to capture something of the spirit of the story. As I've shared before, Rembrandt depicts the elder son standing off to the right side, with a shadowy space left between him and his father and brother. He seems a little higher in the painting, as though perhaps on a platform, and his posture, as I've said before, is bolt upright, his hands in a crossed, closed position, as he appears to look down with a mixture of judgment, disgust, pity, contempt, and disapproval. While there is a gentle light that shines on the father and the younger son, the elder son, while having some light on him, appears to be disappearing in the shadows. You can almost hear the words he speaks in the parable in verse 30, when he addresses his father and describes his younger brother with these words, "This son of yours." In these words he seems to have disowned not just his younger brother, but even his father. "This son of yours." Henri Nouwen writes of himself, "It's hard for me to concede that this bitter, resentful, and angry man might be closer to me in a spiritual way than the lustful younger brother. And yet the more I think about the elder son, the more I recognize myself in him." Henri Nouwen goes on, "All my life," he says, "I have harbored a strange curiosity for the disobedient life that I myself didn't dare to live. I've known the envy toward the wayward son. It is the emotion that arises when I see my friends having a good time doing all the sorts of things that I condemn. I call their behavior reprehensible and even immoral, but at the same time," he says, "I've often wondered why I didn't have the nerve to do some of it, or even perhaps all of it myself. The obedient, dutiful life of which I am proud, or for which I am praised," he says, "sometimes feels like a burden that was laid upon my shoulders and that continues to oppress me." And so Henri Nouwen writes that he has no difficulty identifying with the elder son, who in verse 29 complains, "All these years I've slaved for you, and never once disobeyed any of your orders, yet you have never offered me so much as a kid to celebrate with my friends." In this complaint, obedience and duty have become a burden, and service has become slavery. Henri Nouwen writes that the lostness of the younger son is obvious, but the lostness of the elder son is much harder to identify. After all, he did all the right things. He was obedient, dutiful, law-abiding, hard-working. People respected him, admired him, praised him, and likely considered him a model son. Outwardly he was faultless, but when confronted with his father's joy at the return of his younger brother, a dark power erupts within him and boils to the surface. Suddenly, there becomes glaringly visible a resentful, proud, unkind, ungenerous, selfish person, one who had remained deeply hidden for so long in the shadows of his own heart. If this elder son is lost, he is lost not in a distant country. He's lost not living a wild life somewhere else. He is lost in his own sense of judgment, condemnation, resentment, bitterness, and anger. He's lost in self-imposed rules that the father has never actually placed upon him. Somehow, he has placed them upon himself. And then he has blamed his father. And finally, he is lost in a life without joy. Timothy Keller makes an interesting observation about the older son. He suggests that while the older son outwardly seems to be the polar opposite of the younger son, he is in fact motivated by exactly the same thing. He loves his father's money and his father's stuff more than he loves the father. The only thing that is different are his methods of trying to achieve the same result. The younger son rudely and disrespectfully blurts out that he wants his portion of the inheritance and then runs off and wastes it when he gets it. But the older son has a longer-term strategy. He too has his eye on his father's wealth, and he aims to achieve it by compliance rather than rebellion. But on the inside, there is no real warmth or love towards his father. He is more interested in the money than relationship with the Father. And so rather than living every day in the light and joy of being his Father's son, sharing all that his Father has, he comes to regard his Father as a kind of an enemy, as a slave driver from whom he will one day finally get his just deserts. In the end, both sons are lost. But only one returns. Wild, lustful living can be wasteful and destructive. That's the story of the younger son. But resentment and anger can be equally destructive because it leaves no room for love. It is often the resentful saint whose moralistic intensity can spill over into fanaticism. Henri Nouwen writes that joy and resentment cannot coexist. The elder son refuses to join in the joyful celebration of a lost son who has come to his senses and finally returned home. If it is true that joy and resentment cannot coexist, then it is also true that love and resentment cannot coexist either. Perhaps what the parable is suggesting is that the spiritual answer to a destructive life of wild and wasteful living is not to go to the opposite extreme of moralistic and dutiful kind of extremism. If our obedience, our sense of morality, and if our sense of duty rob us of our joy, and if they prevent us from celebrating life and expressing love and grace and forgiveness towards others, and instead produces a resentment and an anger within us, then it should be an alarm bell that something is wrong. Just as the younger son needs to learn something of the more responsible ways of his older brother, so the older brother in the parable needs to learn something from the younger brother too, in how perhaps to let his hair down, to enjoy life a little. The answer does not lie in the extremes, but in a middle way. How can the elder son in me, and perhaps in you, return home? Because I can see that there's definitely an elder son living in me. Jesus leaves the question open, although he makes it very clear that the father who runs out to meet the younger son is the same father who leaves the celebration to meet the older son too. There is no favoritism here. The father desires for the elder son to join in the party. As Henri Nouwen wrestled with this question in his own life, he came to the conclusion that the way for the elder son to return is through trust and through gratitude. Firstly, to begin to trust that God is not the slave driver that I thought God was, that I can relax sometimes, that I can make time to let my hair down, that rest, celebration, and joy are perhaps as important as duty and hard work. If I'm resentful that others are not working hard enough, then maybe it is a sign that I am working too hard, taking on more responsibility than God is asking of me, that I perhaps am beginning to put myself in the place of God. And secondly, through a life of gratitude. Henri Nouwen writes that gratitude is the opposite of resentment. Resentment blocks the perception that life is a gift. My resentment tells me that I don't receive what I deserve and others are getting more than they should. And so underlying my resentment is normally a hidden envy. By contrast, gratitude brings us back to our senses, back to the here and now, enabling us to experience the truth that all of life is a pure gift. And so Henri Nouwen writes in conclusion, there's always the choice between resentment and gratitude. Because God has appeared in my darkness, He has urged me to come home and declared in a voice filled with affection, you are with me always, and all I have is yours. Indeed, I can choose to dwell in the darkness in which I stand, to point to those who are seemingly better off than I, and to lament at my misfortunes, or there is the option to look into the eyes of the one who came out to search for me, and to see therein that all I am and all I have is pure gift, calling for gratitude. And this takes a leap of faith and trust. And every time I make this little leap, I catch a glimpse again of the one who runs out to meet me with joy. Amen.